Chapter 5 just dropped for Global, and we have everyone's favorite not witch Wilbell and everyone's favorite little sister Nio added to the playable cast. So let's check out what they do and how they perform. The TLDR fast version, Wilbell is a very strong AoE attacker, but overlaps other characters with similar capabilities. And Nio has a unique but extremely niche kit that doesn't have much place in any content up to what's current in JP. I personally like them a lot character-wise and ended up sparking Wilbell, but haven't had as many opportunities to use them as I would like. Considering the upcoming banners, it's probably better to skip this one and save gems for those. I'll talk more about them at the end to avoid spoilers. Getting into more detail, let's start with Wilbell. The big question when it comes to Wilbell is Aisha, Nio, or Lot. Well, fortunately, she specializes in multiple targets. She's the first attacker to have AoE for both her normal skill 2 and her burst. Her skill 2 gives her a skill damage buff after use that lasts for 3 attacks and scales based on the number of enemies, up to 3, and her burst has a base damage bonus that scales similarly. At 3-star, her burst is 480% with 3 targets up, similar in power to single-target bursts. For comparison, Free Resna's burst at 5-star is 420% with the weakness bonus, and 3-star/Logi comes in at only 360% against break. So big damage good, right? Well, the problem is that her playstyle is at odds with the normal game plan of trying to delete enemies from the board as soon as possible, one at a time if necessary. Instead, she's strongest when there are multiple enemies left. But keeping them all around while she's setting up means you're taking much more incoming damage or dealing with heals, ailments, and the enemy's own setups. It's a hard position to maintain that becomes easier when you get access to better healing and sustain, or in the longer term, when you have a greater power advantage over enemies. In the meantime, against content with roughly even power level to your own, her being optimized for multiple targets is a bit double-edged. Last thing to note is that her speed is quite high at 255, so she'll start ahead of most AoE breakers, a bit inconvenient. Her skill 1 can somewhat offset this, providing fire resist down that can help with Mary's breaking. But if you're hoping to get the skill 2 buff, the damage is kinda wasted hitting before break and her first proper attack is quite delayed. Alright, moving on to Nio next. Nio's main gimmick is that she uses a cover mechanic to guard your characters, instead of the traditional passive taunt that other defenders have to make enemies target them. Since she lacks the standard tank passive, by default, enemies are not more likely to attack her than your other party members. Instead, her skill 1 applies 3 stacks of the protection status to herself, which works exactly like the version of this effect that you've seen on enemies like sheep and knights. Anytime there's an incoming single target attack, she uses 1 stack and rushes to intercept. The main advantage of this is that it will even block things like counter hits and skills that specifically ignore the taunt passives. Pretty cool, huh? Well, as long as you can keep the protection stacks up. Skill 1 also gives her a minor 5% reduction in damage received for 3 attacks. For the rest of her skills, her skill 2 is a party-wide single attack 24% damage reduction barrier. And last, her burst skill is a party-wide 14% HP regen effect that ticks at the start of each character's turn for their next 5 turns. The problem with this burst is that it has no upfront heal, so it doesn't work well in emergencies as a panic button, in which case you're probably better off bursting with someone else. Nio's other notable feature is her synthesis gift trait. When used for crafting gear, she gives enhanced Fizz and Mag Resist Up D, which increases the effect of physical and magic defensive buffs applied by the wearer to defenders. She's currently the only character with this trait. Note, however, that it does not apply to untyped generic buffs like her own skill 2, making it much less useful. So now that we've read the manuals, let's go for a test drive. I'll start with a team and gear that simulates what's available in Global now, then move up to show how the characters scale. I'm running Wilbell Nio 2 AoE breakers and then Ixel for buffs. Ixel having single target healing is not ideal, but otherwise it's a pretty standard comp with a defender and a single AoE character for damage output. We'll aim to break everything in one round, then nuke with Wilbell. We want Nio to be fast, so she can get her defense up before any enemy attacks. For gear, maybe something with healing effects, since she has no way to heal herself normally. The traits can be the usual defender mix of AoE defense, any other defense, and maybe resolve recovery. Next up will be Wilbell. As mentioned before, she's so fast that it's hard to get breakers ahead of her without cutting a lot of their output, so we'll just let her go ahead. We want Ixel to be positioned after Wilbell so that he can buff her after her first throwaway attack and before she goes again. We can also use his skill 1 to adjust Wilbell's next turn for panels. We'll give him whatever supporter gear with enhanced attacker buffs and recovery boost traits. Finally, you would usually want your breakers earlier in your order, but since they can't outspeed Wilbell, we'll just aim to break everything before her turn 2. The gear is some random filler with break traits. For the destination, I'll be running a Risk 10 dungeon, the challenge tier intended for level 60 to 70, with the dungeon effects and enemy stats cranked way up. As a decent sample of harder content that isn't trivial to steamroll. For some reason, Risk 10 isn't out in Global yet, but I expect it to be soon. It came before the Affinity Towers in JP. We'll use Drift Blossom Marsh, since it gives a fair advantage to fire and wind without being straight up rigged for Wilbell like the Chapter 5 maps. There's also good single-target enemies and a golem with counter in the middle, so we can showcase Nio's skill set. Jumping into battle right off the bat, you'll notice the first problem with Nio. You need to pick between buffing her cover or setting the stronger barrier, but having no control over who gets attacked. In general, not having passive taunt means wasting actions applying active cover. It being skill 1 can also interfere with your turn orders. Since these weasels are single target, let's try the cover for now. Wilbell uses skill 2 into no damage for the buff. It's a cool 34% skill damage. Ixel buffs Wilbell. Then we don't have enough break damage. So Nio intercepts all 3 attacks and promptly gets blown up. So that's the second problem with Nio. With only 5% reduction from skill 1, she really isn't tanky enough to comfortably jump in front of 3 attacks in a row. As you can see, these guys are pretty tanky. Anyway, let's try that again with some better break gear. This time we'll try the barrier. With the extra damage reduction, the other party members should be able to take a hit, unless they get focused. Since we probably can't kill with a round 2 skill 2, we'll shift things around a bit and try to get the burst panel.
こいつは燃えるぜ。
一気に行きましょう。
こいつはきついぜ。
Luckily, the weasels spread their hits, but their attacks shuffled the turns.
いつでも行けるよ。
Nio still has her barrier unused and gets her cover up.
今なら何だってできちゃうよ。私が守ります。人暴れするわよ。
Wilbell stacks another skill too. We'll shift her onto the burst panel with other characters.
少しはやりそうね。私が出ます。守り神よ、私たちの元へ。
The break puts Wilbell onto the panel as planned.
私に任せなさい。準備バッチリ。前に出るよ。
Mary debuffs and Ixel buffs.
火力全開だぜ。
いつでも行けるよ。
俺は引かねえぞ。とっておきの一皿だぜ。
一気に決めちゃおう。元気出していこう。
ありがとな。
私を本気にさせてしまったようね。
And finally, with a long list of buffs, Wilbell bursts.
私だって気をつけていこう。強そうね。とっておきを見せて。空よ、落ちてきなさい。どう？すごいでしょ。
The bluefin is not impressed, so we'll do another round to clean up.
根性を見せる。前に出るよ。これも
全員で攻めるぜ。
これでは力が。準備バッチリ。
You'll notice that we've managed to stack up a lot of barrier after interrupting the enemies with break. Depending on how the targeting went, this might allow other members to take hits and give Nio a break, a silver lining to not having automatic taunt always on.
根性を見せるよ。 絶好調。
For the second fight with only one weasel, we can cover without issue. Just shift Wilbell onto the panel, burst, and repeat.
私を本気にさせてしまったようね。とっておきを見せ。空よ、落ちてきなさい。どう？すごいでしょ。
At last, we're at the mid-boss.
タギタにしてあげる。一気に決めちゃおう。
I doubt I can break in the first round, so I'll need Nio to cover the hits, especially the hard-hitting wyvern.
やってみせます。今なら何だってできちゃうよ。任せなさいって。入れよ、魔法のかぼちゃ爆
全員で
弾。
攻めるぜ。俺たちの力をお見舞いしてやる。
根性を見せるよ。
こいつは
私が守ります。
燃えるぜ。
少しはやりそうね。
いつでもいけるぜ。
いつでもいけるよ。これで一気に決めちゃう。私に任せなさい。気をつけていこう。前に出る。みんな下がってて。
俺たちの本気味わいな。
解放します。
As expected, it's not enough.
飽きません。秘伝の技見せてあげます。みんなで行く。どうしましょう。
Turns out these things hit hard, and Nio's cover gets her blown up again.
俺は引かねえぞ。
飽きません。少しはやりそうね。
Well, let's play out the battle a bit anyway and see how it'd proceed.
私を本気にさせてしまったようね。人暴れするわよ。しょうがないな。ありがとう。てい、ありがとう。はっ、助かった。今なら何だってできちゃうよ。強そうね。 っておきを見せ空よ落ちてきなさいどうすごいでしょ褒めてよ気持ち悪くなっちゃった
Looks like even with Outbreak, buffed Wilbell is almost good enough. Let me update my gear, get Nio up to 70, and we'll run it again. Strike gets better damage reduction gear in the future, and it becomes possible to double up Resolve defense. Let's also kick up Wilbell's offensive power a bit. And back into the dungeon we go. You can see that the extra stats and reduction make it much more viable for Nio to just cover all the hits. We'll fast forward ahead to the mid-boss. Since Nio will intercept the weasel and get her turn knocked back, we'll position Wilbell on the space behind the burst.
こいつは燃えるぜ
This time, Nio survives both hits, and with the Resolve defense, even the golem counter she intercepts. Unfortunately, items are not ready yet, so instead of the burst, we'll play it out a bit and reposition. Nio's barrier gets us through the golem's blue panel AoE. We use Nio's burst so our party can recover a bit in the turns leading up to Wilbell's burst. And last, Wilbell nukes, killing even the golem without break. Anyway, that's the rough idea of how Wilbell and Nio gameplay looks. It's not the cleanest win, but the better stats and gear makes the setup manageable. It's also not particularly more effective than using a comp with a different defender and free Resna for damage output, since even fully geared, Wilbell's skill 2 doesn't clear anything on its own. And there is, however, one specific case where Nio is extremely good, but I'll split that into a separate vid since this has run a bit long. Same with the discussion of future units, but the short version is that the next 3 non-seasonal banners, probably starting immediately after the current banner, feature 3 of the strongest characters in the game. I hope this helped with understanding how Wilbell and Nio work. Thanks for watching.